It's looking more and more like 2020 is just the year of the number 5 in camera models. We've already had Nikon release the Z5, which was a slightly watered down version of the Z6. We've got, seemingly looks like Panasonic are about to announce an S5 as a slightly watered down version of the S1. Rumours are growing that Sony are bringing out an A5, which we'll discuss shortly, was a watered down version of an A7. And then you've got Canon, who've got the R5, which just needs to be watered down to stop it catching fire. That's probably triggered some fanboys. Let me make it up to you. So what I actually want to discuss today is does that work?
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
I'll get him back at the end. So what I actually want to discuss today is the rumoured A5 and also the, not as of yet rumoured anyway, A7 IV. Now I know I've discussed both of these cameras in the past, but since those videos, firstly we've had some more information about what to expect from the A5, and secondly the A7 IV, my video on that was discussing what I thought the specs were going to be, which was based very heavily on what I thought the specs of the A7S III were going to be. Obviously now we've had the A7S III, and I've been proven wrong in several aspects, which now potentially changes what to expect from the A7 IV. Now, in terms of the A5, the latest rumoured specs seem to suggest that it is essentially going to be the internals of an A7 III transferred into the body of an A6600, which I don't think would be a particularly bad camera, to be fair. In theory, it should be launched cheaper than the A7 III was. The only thing that really remains to be seen with this A5 for me is what are they going to do with the screen and the viewfinder. Now, when the rumours of the A5 originally came out, my prediction was that it was going to be exactly like the A6600 with the flip-up screen. But obviously now we've had the A7S III release, so that's thrown a big question mark over will we still see a flip up and over screen, or is it going to have a side flip screen the same as the A7? Personally, I hope that it is a flip up and over, because as I've said in previous videos, for shooting yourself in these sorts of scenarios, a flip up and over works better because the screen stays on the same vertical axis as the lens, rather than constantly having to look off to the side, which is more noticeable that you're then not looking down the lens. So given the choice between flip up and over and flip round to the side, I personally would rather see a flip up and over. But I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to see a flip round to the side. Although, any sort of front-facing screen I think is better than no front-facing screen. Now, the next big question mark in the rumours is it going to have a viewfinder at all? And really, I think this is going to depend on how Sony are planning on marketing this camera. If they're planning on marketing it as a cheap full-frame camera all round to try and get more people into their full-frame system, so it's going to be appealing to both stills and video shooters, then it's going to have a viewfinder. However, if they're going to try and market it like they did the ZV-1, where it's all geared towards vloggers and video shooters, then arguably the need for a viewfinder does get diminished slightly, and they might decide that having no viewfinder and being able to drop the cost would be more beneficial than having a viewfinder that not many people are going to use. Or they could possibly have like a removable viewfinder similar to what Canon have. I just hope they don't price it similar to what Canon do. I mean, for me personally, I would be happy to see the A5 with no viewfinder and a much cheaper price tag. Because, well, the only reason I have the A6400, which I'm filming with now, is because the A7 III doesn't have a flip-up screen. And I can't remember the last time I ever looked through the viewfinder on this camera. For me, I wouldn't miss the viewfinder on an A5, but I appreciate that probably some people will. So it's going to be interesting to see how Sony try to market this A5. Is it going to be a cheap all-round hybrid camera, or is it going to be a cheap video focus camera? Who knows? But let's move on to the A7 IV. Now, like I said, I have put out roughly what I thought the A7 IV was going to be in the past, but that was based on a few assumptions of what I thought was going to happen with the S3. So firstly, I figured the A7S III would see a bump in resolution to 24 megapixels to allow it to shoot 6K recording like Panasonic's do, which then would have dictated probably the A7 IV would get a bump in resolution to say 36 megapixels to try and fill the gap between the S and the R. Obviously, the S3 threw a slight spanner in the works by sticking with 12 megapixels, which does leave an argument for the A7 IV to stay at 24 megapixels. Although, if they are bringing out an A5 that is 24 megapixels, then there is then the argument that you'd still want to increase the resolution of the A7 IV into the 30 megapixel territory as a way of differentiating it more from the A5. The only real argument I can see for them keeping 24 megapixels as opposed to going higher is so that they can continue to do the 4K as a 6K downsample and not do any pixel binning. That's the only real benefit to that I can see. Although even if they don't increase the resolution, I still want to see them make a new sensor. You know, by all means take the A7 III sensor and drop it into the A5 because it's still a really good sensor, really competent sensor. But I would like to see a newer sensor in the A7 IV with the newer improved readout speeds that we're seeing from the A9 Mark II, the A7R4 and the A7S III as well. Even if that faster data throughput doesn't translate directly into, say, faster shooting speeds and they still shoot at 10 frames a second, it will mean reduced rolling shutter, which I'm seeing more and more people suffer with, both stills and video shooters. Not just the jelly effect in video, but also shooting under artificial lighting in stills as well. So a newer sensor, regardless of resolution, I would love to see in the A7 IV. Now, realistically, in terms of shooting speed, anyway, I don't think it's going to go beyond 10 frames a second. The R4 is still at 10 frames a second, although that's 61 megapixels, that's not a surprise. But the S3 is still at 10 frames a second with only 12 megapixels. So I think all the A7s are basically going to stick at 10 frames a second, which I don't think is really a problem. I think 10 frames a second is more than adequate for the majority of people these days. Now, in terms of video specs, obviously the A7 III shoots 4K at 30 and 1080 at 120 frames a second. Now, with the introduction of the S3, which does 4K up to 120, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect the A7 IV to be able to do 4K at 60 frames a second. What else? Memory cards. This is another interesting one that the S3 released through a spanner in the works, because I think everyone just assumed that the S3 and then subsequently the A7 IV would have dual SD card slots, probably both UHS 2. And then Sony kind of pulled the rabbit out of the hat by introducing CF Express Type A and that funky new card slot on the S3 that takes both CF Express Type A and SD cards. So now leads to the question, what are they going to do with the A7 IV? Is it going to be just two UHS 2 SD card slots, so it's still an upgrade from the A7 III, or are they going to make at least one or two of the slots CF Express Type A compatible? I'm going to guess that one of them is going to be Type A compatible because I'm pretty sure that those double compatible card slots in the S3 are more expensive than just a standard UHS 2 SD card slot. So putting two dual compatible card slots into the A7 IV is going to bump up the price even more. Arguably, not putting any in at all is going to help keep the price down. However, I do think CF Express Type A is going to be the long-term replacement to SD cards. With a camera like the A7 IV, which is likely to be a very big seller, by including at least one Type A slot, it's going to start the ball rolling in getting people into buying Type A cards. What else? Viewfinder. Yes, this is another thing that I think an area that is going to see an improvement over the A7 III. Because the A7 III's viewfinder, I'm pretty sure, was the same viewfinder panel that was in the A7 II. It gets the job done, but it's not fantastic. And obviously now we've seen the A7 IV, the A7S III get much better panels, and electronic viewfinders are probably one of the biggest complaints that I see from people who don't want to switch from DSLRs, saying that they don't like that crappy pixelated view in an electronic viewfinder, which is fair enough. But I think that's going to be the target for manufacturers now, is improving the electronic viewfinders to a point that they are almost indistinguishable from optical viewfinders. Now, I don't think Sony are going to design a brand new EVF just for the A7 IV, because it would make more sense to use a component they're already making. But it's unlikely that they're going to put either the viewfinder from the R4 or the S3, because they're current generation tech, and they'll want something to help differentiate those from the cheaper models. So actually, it wouldn't surprise me if we found that the A7 IV takes the EVF from the old R3. That way it's still better than the A7 III's viewfinder without being as good as the more expensive cameras. So that pretty much sums up my predictions for the A7 IV and the A5. So now to round the video off. As promised, he is back. They're over there. So what are your predictions of the A7 IV and A5? What features do you think they will have? What do you think they won't have? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. While you're down there, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and also consider checking out my Patreon account as well, where you can help support the channel from just $5 a month, and in return you'll get some exclusive behind the scenes content and access to prize giveaways as well. As always, thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.